There's a kind of headline Moscow absolutely hates, and it's not the obvious one. It's not "Ukraine got hit again," because that headline is noise, now a tragic routine. The headline Moscow hates is the one that makes everyone pause and realize, this isn't strength, this is pressure, and the strike package aimed at electricity and heating, timed right on top of talks in Abu Dhabi, is exactly that kind of headline. This is the worst news Moscow did not want you to hear, because it doesn't just describe damage, it describes position. It tells you who feels comfortable at the table and who needs the table to feel colder. People argue about missiles and drones like they're the whole story. They're not. The story is the moment Moscow chose and the thing Moscow chose to target. If you want to understand the real pressure on Moscow, look at timing and target, not what exploded, but what was supposed to be happening while it exploded. In this video, we're going to peel back 3 layers. What just happened, what Moscow was trying to say, and why ironically this is bad news for Moscow itself. Quick note. If you're in a conflict zone, follow official air raid guidance and local law. Don't live stream sensitive locations. Information can cost lives faster than any missile, so here's what happened, clean and simple. On January 24, 2026, Russia launched a major drone and missile strike on Ukraine's 2 biggest urban targets, Kyiv and Kharkiv, overnight and into the morning. Ukrainian officials framed it as an attempt to disrupt or shape the negotiations happening in the United Arab Emirates, where U.S.-mediated contacts and meetings were continuing. That overlap is not a coincidence you shrug off. It's a sentence Moscow wrote in all caps, while diplomats were trying to speak in lowercase, and the civilians in apartment blocks were the ones forced to read it first. And notice what the strike emphasized. Not just city, but systems. The grid, the heating plants, the substations, things that don't bleed on camera but decide whether a city breathes. One Ukrainian energy company said tens of thousands of households in Kyiv were cut off from electricity immediately after the strikes. The mayor's office also described a renewed heating crisis, with thousands of buildings losing heat again after repairs from earlier attacks. You can rebuild a wall fast. You can't rewarm a city fast. That lag is the weapon. Electricity in winter isn't a convenience, it's a circulatory system. Heating isn't comfort, it's the thin line between normal life and survival mode. When power drops, water pumps slow, elevators stop, phone batteries die, and suddenly a high rise becomes a concrete stairwell. Test. When heating drops, pipes freeze, hospitals strain, schools close, and families start making decisions that have nothing to do with politics and everything to do with minutes and degrees. In some reports, the temperature in and around Kyiv was well below 0 Celsius during this period. Cold turns every small failure into a chain reaction. And chain reactions are the point. Here's the detail that should sit heavy in your stomach. After the strikes, officials said heating was knocked out again across thousands of buildings. And even after emergency crews worked through the night, more than 1,000 buildings were still without heat the next morning. That number matters because it's not a blackout. It's a city cut into cold zones and warm zones, block by block. That's what infrastructure warfare looks like when it's done intentionally, not a crater. A map of discomfort, and this is where people misread it. They treat power and heating like secondary targets, like collateral. But when you aim at electricity and heat, you're not just hitting Ukraine, you're editing the negotiation atmosphere. You're trying to bring the winter into the room where people are talking about ceasefires and terms. It's a psychological lever that says, while you speak, I can still change the temperature of your reality. You don't need to win ground for that, you just need the lights to flicker while the talks continue. Now ask a ruthless question. If you're truly confident at the table, if you believe time is on your side, do you need to turn off the other side as heat right then? That's not a moral question yet, that's a mechanical question. Confident powers signal patience. Insecure powers signal immediacy, confident powers make offers. Pressured powers create emergencies, and an emergency aimed at heaters, in the middle of diplomacy, is the kind of move that reeks of urgency even when it's dressed up as strategy, because electricity and heating are not targets, they're hostages. They force governments to spend attention, money, and political capital on repair instead of bargaining. They force leaders to speak about air defense, generators, and shelters instead of frameworks and timelines. They force the world to watch civilians shiver while diplomats shake hands, and that contrast warm conference rooms, cold apartments is exactly what makes the headlines stick. It's the kind of image that doesn't flatter Moscow, even when the missiles hit. So yes, the strikes hurt Ukraine in the direct way everyone understands, but the hidden angle, the one Moscow hates, is what the timing reveals about Moscow. When you have to manufacture darkness to create leverage, you're admitting something without saying it. You re-admitting you need the pain to do work that your position can do on its own. And once you see that, the next question becomes unavoidable: what message was Moscow trying to send in Abu Dhabi, and why might that message backfire the moment it lands? Because the message wasn't "we can hit you." That's been understood for a long time. The message was "we can change the conditions of your life while you trying to change the conditions of the war." It's a different kind of threat, and it only works if the timing is surgical. When the talks are happening, when headlines are watching, when everyone is asking whether Moscow is serious about an off-ramp, then the lights go out and the heat goes cold. Look at the scale being reported, because it explains why this was chosen as the language. Reports said Russia used hundreds of drones and missiles in that wave. Ukraine's Air Force put out numbers in that direction, and the outages weren't local. One estimate said at least 1.2 million consumers lost power across the country, including around 800,000 in Kyiv. In the same window, officials said roughly 6,000 apartment blocks in the capital were without heat on the morning after, a jump from previous days, and the temperature wasn't forgiving. Overnight readings were being reported around -13°C. That's not infrastructure damage as a policy debate. That's a stopwatch. Now add a detail that makes this feel less abstract. A Kyiv outlet described apartment indoor temperatures dropping 2 single digits Celsius after prolonged power cuts. Another update said crews restored heat to over 1,000 buildings overnight, but still left 1,676 buildings without heating the next morning. That's the real signature of this tactic, not total destruction. But churn: you repair, then you get hit again, then you repair again. The city never stabilizes because stability is the thing Moscow is trying to tax. So what was Moscow trying to say in Abu Dhabi? Not in press releases, in behavior. When you strike energy and heating during diplomacy, you're basically putting 3 sentences on the table without speaking them out loud. Sentence 1: we can still make the war feel immediate, even if you try to turn it into paperwork. Sentence 2: any timeline you discuss can be disrupted on demand. Sentence 3: if you want calm, you pay for it. It's coercion dressed as military logic, and it's designed to make negotiators feel like winter is leaning over their shoulder. Ukraine's officials called it out exactly in that frame. One of the sharpest lines that circulated was that the missiles didn't just hit people, they hit the negotiation table, and that is the point. The strike wasn't meant to win the talks, it was meant to haunt them. You can't negotiate cleanly when your capital is running on generators, when hospitals are rationing power, when crews are racing dawn to reconnect heating lines. You don't get the luxury of calm strategy. You get the tyranny of urgent logistics. But here's what people miss: that same move quietly reveals Moscow's mood. It reveals impatience. It reveals a need to manufacture leverage instead of simply having it. Confident actors don't need to synchronize their violence with diplomacy because their leverage survives daylight. Pressured actors do. When the timing becomes the story, it's because the position is weaker than the image, and Moscow cares about image like it's a currency, because in geopolitics, credibility is a currency. That's why this is the kind of news Moscow hates, not because it proves they can hurt Ukraine, but because it suggests they have to. One bad implication is that the "we're negotiating in good faith" storyline becomes harder to sell to anyone watching from the outside. A strike wave aimed at civilian energy systems during talks reads like sabotage, even if Moscow insists it's military necessity. Another implication is that it invites the exact opposite of what Moscow wants: more urgency, yes, but not necessarily toward concessions. Often it's urgency toward air defenses, toward hard guarantees, toward mechanisms that reduce Moscow's freedom of action later. And the third implication is the simplest and most humiliating. The talks didn't stop. Reports described the contacts continuing and resuming even after the strikes, with language like constructive floating around the coverage, and the second day eventually ending without some dramatic breakthrough that matters more than it seems. Because if you unleash a winter blackout strategy to seize momentum, and the other side still shows up to the table, you've paid a political price without buying the result you wanted. You've told the world you're willing to escalate civilian pressure during diplomacy, and the world writes that down, not as a rumor, as a precedent. And yes, there is a counter-argument that sounds cold but isn't stupid. Maybe Moscow thinks this is exactly how you raise the price. Maybe they believe pain in Kyiv translates into leverage. In Abu Dhabi, maybe the goal isn't to stop talks, but to shape the next round, to make Kyiv's public anxious, to make partners nervous, to make everyone crave stability enough to accept a bad deal. In pure bargaining theory, shock can move a negotiation. Except this particular shock is risky in a very specific way. When you hit electricity and heating, you aren't just pressuring a government. You're forcing the moral framing of the entire moment. It becomes easier to argue the target is civilian endurance, not battlefield capability. And once the frame shifts to civilian endurance, outside actors start asking different questions. Not what territory is negotiable, but what protection is missing. Not what compromises are realistic, but what enforcement would stop this happening again. You can almost feel the conversation tightening, like a knot being pulled. That's the part that quietly flips the script. Moscow tries to inject fear, but fear doesn't always bend. Sometimes it hardens. A city without heat doesn't just create despair. It creates clarity. People stop debating abstractions and start demanding concrete defenses, and governments that might have been tempted to drift into process suddenly remember that process is meaningless if the lights can be switched off every time someone speaks the word peace. There's also a deeper layer, and it's uncomfortable. This tactic treats domestic life as a dial. Turn it down, watch the pressure rise, hope the other side cracks. But when you do that while cameras are rolling on diplomacy, you're also inviting the world to measure you by a simpler standard than strategy. You're asking them to judge intent, and intent is the one thing you can't easily negotiate away later because it sticks to you. Long after a missile crater is filled, the memory of a freezing night during peace talks becomes a story people repeat. So when you hear power and heating, don't file it under infrastructure, file it under leverage and then file it under exposure. The strike was a signal, but it was also a confession that Moscow doesn't feel safe letting diplomacy run on its own rhythm, a confession that they need the cold to speak for them. And once you understand that, you can start seeing the next move before it happens, because there are only a few directions this kind of pressure can go, and each one carries a cost Moscow may not be able to control. And this is where the story turns on Moscow in a way the missiles can't fix. The strikes didn't happen in a vacuum. They happened under a spotlight while delegations were sitting in Abu Dhabi trying to sell the idea that a process exists. You can call it pressure, you can call it leverage, you can even call it bargaining. But to everyone watching from the outside, it looks like a regime trying to negotiate with one hand and squeeze a civilian city with the other. That's not strength, that's exposure. Because the first piece of bad news for Moscow is that the timing quietly admits something. When you feel comfortable at a table, you let the table do the work. When you don't, you try to make the room colder. Russia didn't just hit Kyiv and Kharkiv. It synchronized fear with diplomacy, like it needed the fear to speak louder than its negotiators could, and once that pattern is visible, it becomes harder for Moscow to maintain the image it lives off of, the image of control. Great powers don't need to create emergencies on the same day they want to be taken seriously as peacemakers. The second piece of bad news is the cost that comes with choosing electricity and heating as your megaphone. Reports around the January 24th wave described hundreds of drones and missiles being used and massive disruption to energy systems in freezing conditions. One account described roughly 1.2 million people losing power across Ukraine, including around 800,000 in Kyiv, with temperatures around -13 C. Kyiv. Post, in a separate update, described nearly 1 million without power in Kyiv while the city's heating system was hit again. That's the image the world receives. Not military targets, but a capital city being pushed into darkness during winter while diplomats talk about peace. And the third piece of bad news is the simplest. The process didn't stop. Even after the strikes, multiple reports described negotiations continuing or resuming, with language like constructive still being used and future rounds being discussed. That's a strategic failure disguised as violence. If the goal was to freeze the table stayed warm. If the goal was to shock Ukraine into folding, Ukraine still showed up. Moscow spent political capital on a move that hardens reputations against it, and the return on that investment is not guaranteed. Sometimes it's negative. Now, to be fair, there's a counter-argument that sounds brutal, but it's real. Moscow might believe this is how you raise the price, how you remind everyone that time is painful, how you force urgency. A government that can make a capital city go cold can create panic in markets, pressure in public opinion, and anxiety among allies. In a narrow, short-term bargaining sense, you can see the logic, but there's a reason this tactic keeps boomeranging. It pushes the conversation toward defenses and enforcement, not concessions. Once you weaponize electricity and heating, you give Ukraine and its partners a cleaner argument for what they want next: more air defense, more hardened infrastructure, more redundancy. And crucially, tighter guarantees, because nobody will sign a paper deal if the lights can be shut off the next time Moscow wants leverage. Even APS reporting around this January wave leaned into the same theme: thousands of apartment buildings losing heat, extreme cold, and civilian life being strained as officials pursued diplomatic momentum. The pain doesn't just create pressure on Kyiv, it creates a mandate for Kyiv to demand protection with receipts. And this is why electricity and heating are such a powerful target and such a dangerous one politically. It's powerful because it turns modern life into a countdown: phones dying, elevators stopping, hospitals shifting to backup power, pipes freezing, water supply wobbling. It's dangerous because it's hard to spin as anything other than coercion of civilians, especially when it's timed with diplomacy. Unofficials and humanitarian voices have repeatedly framed attacks on civilian infrastructure in moral and legal terms, and that framing sticks. War isn't only territory and tanks. It's also the story the world tells afterward, and Moscow is writing itself into the worst chapter every time it makes winter part of the strategy. So over the next 2 to 8 weeks, there are only a few directions this can realistically go. One path is repetition: more strikes on energy, more rolling blackouts, more attempts to make negotiations happen under stress, like Moscow is trying to negotiate with a foot on the throat. Another path is a narrower deal emerging: something limited, something like don't hit civilian energy systems, because even a fragile process sometimes needs a minimum level of livability to survive. And the third path is escalation on both sides: more strikes, more retaliation, and talks that continue in name but become harsher, longer, and more performative than productive. If you want to follow this without drowning in headlines, watch for 3 tells. First, whether attacks on electricity and heating become more frequent or start tapering, because frequency is the clearest signal of intent. Second, whether diplomatic language moves from vague adjectives like constructive toward concrete mechanics timelines, monitoring, verification, because vague words are cheap and mechanisms are expensive. Third, whether the international response shifts visibly toward air defense and infrastructure protection, because that's the clearest sign the world read this strike as coercion, not bargaining. And one small media habit that helps in moments like this: don't spread unverified clips or claims. Check 2 reputable outlets first, because misinformation is another way civilians get targeted. And that brings us back to the headline Moscow hates. The worst news for Moscow isn't what it fired, it's what it revealed. It revealed that timing is doing work Moscow can't do with confidence alone, and that the target wasn't only a transformer, it was credibility. Ukraine's resistance keeps doing something larger than defense: it strains the whole network of authoritarian coercion that depends on intimidation being effective. It doesn't always feel like hope in the moment, but the long arc is still there. Freedom survives when intimidation stops working. If you want geopolitical analysis that follows the pressure points instead of just counting explosions, you know what to do. Subscribe and stay in the room with me when the next timed move happens. And I'm genuinely curious what you think, because it's the central question of this entire episode. Did this strike help Moscow at the table? Or did it backfire so hard it exposed the pressure Moscow tried to hide?